Welcome everyone to the Little Church Big Sound Master Course. My name is CJ and I am thrilled that you have made the investment in yourself and your team to join me here to learn everything there is about live sound in your church. If there's one thing I've learned over my 15 plus years in running church sound, it's that the very basic fundamental things tend to influence everything else we do. And so by coming to this course and learning everything from the basics to the advanced stuff that we'll be getting into later on this course, you're going to see how everything plays a part in your mix on every Sunday you do. So let's go over real quickly before we go any further into what we're going to be covering in this course. I've got my handy notes here. You'll see me referencing them a lot throughout this course as we go through it. So the first thing we're going to be going through in this module here, which is the intro and role of sound, is, well, obviously we're going to go through what we're all going to talk about here, but then we're going to talk about the role of sound in the church. You see, I think there's a really big important value in discussing what our role as sound engineers is in the church and what our role is as a sound person and what we have to work with in the church is. All the gear and equipment we have access to, or maybe not even have access to. All that is really important to know and understand before we even go any further in this conversation about what it takes to be a live sound engineer in church. The last thing we'll talk about in this module here is you and your leadership. It's absolutely critical that we talk about how you work with your leadership team when it comes to all things live sound. So make sure you go through that lesson before you go any further with all the cool nerdy gear stuff, all the fun tech talk stuff. I promise you, it's really worth taking that time to go in there before you do anything else. Because honestly, the conversations and discussions that we have in that module, in that lesson, really affect everything else down the line. I promise you. Now, after we talk about that, we're going to get into my favorite section, which is gear talk. Gear talk is where we get to talk about all the fun stuff, like microphones and all the different kinds that exist out there too. DI boxes, stage boxes, what's a stage snake, what is a sound console. There's analog and there's digital consoles. We're going to get into all of that. We're going to talk about speakers. There's several different types of speakers that you may see out in the market or in your church or other churches. And we're going to talk about the different kinds and different methods of how each one is used in a scenario. So we'll go through all of that kind of stuff. We're going to talk about digital and analog and the difference between the two and how all digital boards really inherit everything that they do from the analog world. So we're going to go through the little bit of the history lesson of it and how analog shapes how we think and function with digital soundboards. Then we're going to talk about planning your patch. This is a great module where we actually go through some planning steps to really set ourselves up for success. You see, if we don't take the time to plan how our board's going to work and how all of our equipment's going to be working together, then we're really not setting ourselves up for a great mix. So taking the time to actually learn how to plan your patch, how to plan your mix, all these elements is really key to having a great mix. Then we're going to talk about setting up your board, like things like your inputs and outputs, setting up custom layers and how you want to organize your channels. We'll talk about how groups and matrices and mixes all work and how those three words all sound similar but are totally different things. We're going to talk about how it's really critical that you get the best sound out of your source first before anything else. That's a really big topic we'll get into. Then we're going to talk about signal flow. Signal flow is probably the most confusing, but also the most simple thing that every engineer runs through when they're first learning how to do sound, and maybe even still today, if you've been running it for a long time, maybe it still kind of wanders around in your brain a little bit on what is actually signal flow and how does it work. So we're going to go through everything when it comes to that. And then we're going to actually mix. We're going to dive into some multi-tracks that I've captured at my church. You're going to get to hear and see how I approach mixing them in my situation and how I would apply things in my area, which our church isn't a large church. That's probably the biggest reason why I wanted to do this whole thing with you guys. Little Church Big Sound exists for the church that isn't big, that isn't a Bethel or an Elevation or whatever. You know, we are focused on churches that are the average size of an American church here, or even if you're international. You know, there's churches that only exist for 20 to 50 people, sometimes maybe only a couple hundred, and that's massive for some churches in some areas. We're focusing on your church. So we're going to actually go to my church here in Austin, Texas, and we're going to go actually mix on that sound system. We're going to see what it actually takes to mix on that system with what gear we have that isn't multi-million-dollar systems. It isn't the greatest gear. It's good gear, but not the greatest gear that exists out there. We're going to show you how to actually use that equipment. And by the end here, we're going to get into things like monitors, in-ears, wedges, which one's better, which one's worse. How do we make them sound great for our musicians so they have a good mix to play with? Those are all things we're going to cover in our monitoring section of our course. And then lastly, we'll talk about our identity as a sound engineer. I think it's really crucial that after all of this information, we really take the time to kind of just focus it back on ourselves for a second and go, okay, where is my identity as a sound engineer? Because a lot of times as sound engineers, we get caught up in the fact that, oh, if my mix isn't good, then I'm not a good person, or I'm not good at what I do, and blah, blah, blah. Like, we get so tied to our craft as an engineer. We get so tied to, you know, how does it sound? Oh, the pastor didn't like it and now my feelings are crushed, you know, or, you know, who cares about what the people in the front row say? I know what I'm talking about. Like, that stuff has to go. So we'll talk about all of that when we get to the very end of this course, because honestly, I don't think it's really going to come to like a home point until we get through everything else. So with that all said, we've got a lot of information to cover. Take your time with this course. Really just go through it minute by minute. If you have to step away, go step away and come back. You know, I tried to break this up into as many pieces as I can that are bite-sized, but there's a lot of information we're going to go through here. So take your time with it. If you got to go back and rewatch it, I expect you to, because there's going to be so much to go through. So let's get started with our first topic, which is going to be the role of a sound engineer. Let's get started.